So my name is Brian Boigon, and I am the founder of a symposium series called the Culture Lab. And it was in conjunction with my appointment at the University of Toronto School of Architecture from 1990 to 93, 4. Okay, so what was the Culture Lab? The Culture Lab was a new or a novel option to study or research and retrack the world of space and architecture and form, and do it through the use of other production people and other disciplines, from standard physicists, fashion designers, film directors, rave disc jockeys. There's a host of people that I wanted to include and combine and shuffle through the world of design. And because you don't want to have a boundary, I didn't want to have a boundary between design and architecture and the rest of culture, the cultural production. What format would Culture Lab take? That was a big question for me. So first of all, where did it take place? It took place in a nightclub, a rock club. And in particular, I wanted that rock club to have a role. And the participants were used to speaking in those spaces, and those spaces had some, pedigree to them that are associated with scouting talent. In the case of the club I was in, that I picked, is the Rivoli on Queen Street. Queen Street was one of the most dynamic gallery, independent bar performance spaces that ran a strip from McCall Street over to Bathurst. So it was about 1.5 kilometers long. So I wanted to be in there, and I wanted Culture Lab to take place there, which was contrary to where everything else is taking place when I was teaching at the University of Toronto. So everything else was in the School of Architecture building, and I wanted to move it away from that because I wanted to move the consciousness of the individual away from feeling the comfort of, the institution. And I wanted to create another venue for that. And that worked. So where it took place was very important. So I kept it at the club. So I figured out a way to figure out the format of the platform of delivery. So I gave people, I guess you could say, I gave people this one sheet of prompts that's probably going to be in the exhibition's correspondence with a participant. They received this prompt that included a theme of their Culture Lab symposium set. So there were different themes, subjects for each symposia in the Culture Lab: dipsticks, insider criticism, etc. So those were terms that I took from different ways of measuring things in other industries. Like the dipstick was used for measuring liquids in the lab, and it's also used for measuring oil or petroleum. The format pretty well followed short form broadcasting, like not music videos, but City TV, which was down the street from the Rivoli. Moses Neimer founded City TV, and City TV was one of the first, along with MTV in New York, one of the first transparent studios where you could walk along the street and look in the windows while it was being recorded for broadcast in real time. They also had this thing called Speaker's Corner, where anybody could walk into this box and talk about the world, and they would repackage all those videos into a show called Speaker's Corner. So the Rivoli was recorded by video, and it was repackaged per se by two other routines. One was a closed door a round table between the participants who got warmed up together at a gallery where I was exhibiting, and I was represented by the S.L. Simpson Gallery at that time. And she provided the space for the round table. And it was a closed, uninvited roundtable discussion between the participants and myself. And they didn't involve the question per se. They involved, well, what's your approach? What's your approach to the world that I'm presenting? Mostly they said, I have no idea, but they did have an idea. So, but that there was a closed forum for that. And then there was the forum, and there was a forum in the green room. The green room was this classic sort of club space at the back of the stage where the talent get together and warm up. And I didn't change their green room at the Rivoli. I wanted to keep it exactly the way it was. It was super ghetto, grungy, you know. Yeah, that's what it was. It was pretty Nelvana. That's what it was. And so people got very disoriented or nervous from that. But I I I mannered the spaces each with um, a person. So someone took care of the green room. Someone took care of their drink. Someone took care of this. So they were taken care of by all these people running around and getting them things. I was teaching in parallel to the Culture Lab at the time, and my teaching was controversial in the sense that I never posed a traditional building pedagogy for the architecture school or my classes. But I didn't teach Culture Lab themes. I taught things that were related to Culture Lab. Like, for example, I taught a course in the novel related to other things that were associated with fiction. And Canterbury Tales, I taught Canterbury Tales. And I taught Canterbury Tales because it was very architectonic in its structure. I think that that's an interesting aspect of my teaching, where I come up with a cultural phenomena that resolve something or provoke something, like Culture Lab did, in the fact that it was in a nightclub, and it redefined the notion of the symposium. Why would I have a nanophysicist and architect like Peter Eisenman talking about the same thing? And these were all shuffled together like a Scrabble board without letters. And it would have a kind of curious etymology to it that I could sustain in my teaching too. The themes, I was working at the time at a lab, a science lab. And there's a lab in a building called the Mars Lab in Toronto. The Mars Lab was part of an incubator lab that you could take over a lab in. And I had a good friend who was a doctor, and was doing experiments there. So I was asked to help him design his equipment. It was like a Lego project. You had to buy all this stuff from Aspen, like tubes and all kinds of instruments. And then I had to fit them all together. So we were in this lab, and I never really experimented before in a controlled lab or a controlled experiment. So in medicine in particular, there's controls that are very precise, and you can't go over the control. You can't exceed the velocity of, the liquid or whatever. But there are a lot of controls involved. So I thought that was interesting. I was thinking a lot about how I set this thing up, but what it turned into and how it evolved. And that was a interesting challenge for me, because I didn't want to control these people, but I did want to. So it was control without control. I had to insinuate things thematically, and I couldn't tell people what to do, but they had to know that I expected certain things to come from them based on their work. So I introduced them all with their biographies in slightly entertaining ways. The way I came up with the players, they were all interested in the novelty of presenting their ideas in front of other producers that were not from their field. So, for example, Adam McGoyan, the film director, he was very interested in presenting because his work involved media in an intellectual sense for him, but also he liked the combination of different subject matters that were associated in his mind, like Jeannie Randolph, who was an art historian, but her background was in eating disorders at a hospital. That's where she had her full-time job. And so they all had these kind of curious flips through different disciplines. And all the participants were fascinated by the fact that they could speak to these people. Some were a little annoyed or repelled by it, or they commented about that. And other ones misbehaved, but it didn't matter. But a lot of the participants just wanted to position themselves in a different world and talk about their ideas, which is what the exhibitionary factor was about culture that was very rich and very novel. So the club only held 150 people. So I let in 250. And it was jammed, and it evolved into becoming sold out, and a lineup down the street around the block, like 3 blocks down. And it was cheap for anybody who couldn't afford it. It was $5 a ticket. But there were aspects of it that became out of control, like the crowd and people wanting to go see it, and interviews that would happen. And City TV came to interview me, or they came to interview one of the players, and so it became a phenomena. It didn't go viral really. It just exploded as a popular anchor of culture and intensity at the time. And it ran for 3 years like that. All those years were sold out. I think I often question why it became so popular, but also why it became so significant as a beacon of cultural production for the city and for the architecture community, art community, communities. And at the time, I realized that in my teaching architecture, also, architecture was at a standstill for more, and was looking, or at least the producers of architecture, experimental architecture, were trying to find different routines and isms to try to combine together in new ways. And so Culture Lab became a site for that to happen in. And that was unusual, but the timing was correct for it. It could happen only at Culture Lab because it was not part of the university, but it wasn't institutionalized. So that turned on people. Like, it made Manuel de Landa interested. There's some people that were not sold on institutional framing of their ideas. So it became important for that, but also technologically, it was a moment in the history of the transition between the analog and the digital. That was a major attribute of those 3 or 4 years. A lot of the digital phenomena that emerged from that period also emerged from Culture Lab. One of the sponsors for Culture Lab, significant sponsors, was Alias software. Alias invented the spline model and 3D rendering, as you would know, through Rhino. Later, they didn't do Rhino, but they did the other things that led up to that. And they were the computer rendering world of algorithms was always tied to the entertainment business. So, Terminator 2, Liquid Metal, was really Alias, the software, and others. So there was a way in which Culture Lab was part of that innovation. It was an innovative period of clearly looking at other ways to make things happen in other disciplines, but also in other social sequences and other materials. And so that became a big thing in the decade of the 90s. The 90s were significantly important for their digital analog transfusion. They were able to transact those results from one intensity and network to the other. And so culture was part of that. Culture Lab was part of that. And I introduced the cartoon and what Greg Lynn would have called the motion pathway. That would be the spline line. The motion pathway was what cartoon animators would call it. So when I graduated architecture, I also went into the entertainment world where I developed a cartoon called SpillVille, which the CCA has. And SpillVille was optioned, or at least taken over by Saturday Night Live. They optioned it, and Paramount Pictures. And SpillVille was a town that I designed that included all kinds of devices feeding content into it. But I learned a lot about what other people were doing, and I invited some of them into Culture Lab at that time. MIT Media Lab was very significant